Chapter 2. Time log. 3 years earlier. The sun was unusually harsh that long summer's day. The men working in the fields, covered in their hot and heavy work clothes, prayed for just a small cloud of relief. However, there was no cloud in sight, and it looked like there would be no cloud in sight for days. The town, too, seemed dead inside from the heat exhaustion. The old folks sat outside on their porches, rocking back and forth in a fluid motion. Each was comfortably sitting back, with a glass of their favorite beverage close to their face. One of the workers looked up at the sky to see if there was any change in the appearance. As he stared, a small bead of sweat trickled down from his forehead into his eye. Wincing forward, he pushed on his irritated eye with the palm of his hand, letting out a curse or two under his breath. After the salty sting had subsided, the man stepped over his tender crops and grabbed a nearby bottle of water. He tilted his head back and let the water pour down his parched throat, ready for the sweet tingle of refreshment. However, all he tasted was hot metallic steam. Enraged, he threw the bottle on the ground and walked away. Slowly, he meandered towards a house, mumbling under his breath till he reached the porch. An old man sat there relaxed in his rocking chair. "Hey, Pop," the disgruntled worker said as he walked inside. The old man just nodded with a gentle smile and let him pass. After a few seconds, the man came back out with a big jug of water, and with a righteous grin, he began to chug it down with fury. The fresh cold water trickled down inside his body with both pain and pleasure. After he had his fill, he let out an enormous sigh of relief, followed by a loud belch. The old man just ignored his rude son as he looked on towards the street. His eyes locked onto an older woman as she passed by their house. Closely following behind was a young and beautiful girl. "You see that old hag and her granddaughter there?" the old man spoke. The son took a sip and then responded, "Yeah? So, that's Danny's grandma and sister. Things have been quiet around here since Danny and his father left." "Yeah, I remember Danny. The little hooligan was always causing trouble, and his father would always back him up." "You know Danny went to war, right?" The old man stopped rocking. "Yeah, I know. Darn shame, we could have used Danny to do some work around here." The man took another long drink. The old man shifted over to look at his son, to think, 18, a whole life ahead of you, and you give it to your country. There ain't no doubt about it, that boy is patriotic, but he's also going to experience a fresh hell. I remember stories my grandfather told me of boys being called off to fight in the front lines just when they learned how to properly tie their own boots and successfully wipe their own asses. I wonder if Joe knows something and he talked to Danny. Either way, Danny and Joe must be sure that things will turn out all right. The grandma is getting on in years, and the sister has just turned, 18? 19? "Yeah, you're probably right," the man agreed, but wasn't really paying attention to his father's ramblings. There was a short silence. "Whatever happened to that girl that Danny was in love with?" the man asked while wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "I don't know. Right after he left, she just seemed to up and disappear without a trace. The sheriff and deputy went to check around, but there wasn't anything to report. They say she must have just skipped town." Well, I hope she comes back before Danny. You know he has always been weak when it comes to that love stuff." "Yes, poor Danny." The old man sat back in his chair and slowly got it rocking again. Both men took a drink at the same time. The son coughed a little, patted his father on the shoulder, and slung the jug on his back as he trudged back to the fields. The old man took another sip and continued to stare up and down the streets. "Seems like the only thing us old folks are good for is bringing up the past," he muttered to himself as the old woman and her granddaughter disappeared out of view. Mrs. Georgia Blaker was a peaceful old woman. Like anyone who lives long enough on this earth, her skin was beginning to droop and sag. Her clothes became smaller, and her hair turned white. However, one thing you could always count on was her smile. The one tool she had to brighten any face and lighten any mood. She walked briskly for a woman now pushing into her 70th year. Taking care of her body when she was young was paying off as these tough years began to set. Her white hair was wrapped in a chignon bun, which kept it out of her blue eyes. She wore a blue with white gingham gown that stretched down to her ankles. On her feet were a pair of elegant flat tops that were comfortable to look at and not too bad to walk in. Behind her was Danny's sister, Allison Blaker, or Allie to her friends. She also accepted Lily, but only by her brother. Allie was a perfect specimen of grace. Her long, smooth, lustrous brown hair flowed straight and neatly down until it reached the small of her back and curled inwards. Just like her grandmother, she possessed two pools of ultramarine eyes that captivated, and a smile so pure and tender, it could soothe and ameliorate any transgression. She was pure of heart with a strong but cordial soul, and every man in the town respected this. If they didn't, they answered to Danny. She wore a saffron summer dress that swayed just past her knees. A beige belt with a gold buckle was wrapped and fastened around her midriff to not only accentuate her style, but to also keep unwanted gusts of wind from harassing her as she walked. Unlike her grandmother, Allie was wearing two-piece black heels and was succumbing to the pains of beauty. She put her silky smooth hands on her hips and tried to keep herself from falling. "Slow down, Grandma. I can't keep up with you," she pleaded. "I told you not to wear those stupid heels, Allie. Anyway, we're almost home, so tough it out, girl." What would Danny say? Georgia refused to slow down. When they were young, Danny would constantly pick on Allie, teasing her over the little things, like her hair being messy or her music being stupid, to the point that Allie would cry and run off. However, Danny would always chase after her immediately, apologize for upsetting her, and they would make up with a hug while her smile beamed. Danny and Allie had the typical sibling relationship of a big brother and little sister. When Grandma said his name, Allie had flashbacks of around 5 years ago. A boy had taken advantage of her kindness and humiliated her in front of the entire school. The next day the boy was brought to the hospital, unconscious with a black eye and a bump on the back of his head. When he came to, he feigned that he could not remember what had happened and later apologized to Allie in front of everyone at school. Just as Allie began to return from her memories, she became aware that they had arrived at their destination. A cozy beat-up home, just a little outside of town, completely made of wood and amazingly termite-free. On the porch, a graying sheltie slept peacefully, but instantly awoke to familiar sounds and smells. The ecstatic 10-year-old wagged its tail as it lifted itself up. "Come here, Jack." Allie cheered with both hands stretched forward as the dog panted, greeting them with an excited, but aged, gruff, as he tapped left to right like a puppy. The old woman ignored the dog and walked inside. When Allie was done giving attention to Jack, she ascended the front steps onto the porch. She looked to her right and stared at one of the support pillars for the roof overhead. It had hers and Danny's name written all over it, with marks to show how tall they had become. She looked up at Danny's last mark. "I wonder how tall you are now? I wish Mom got to see how we grew." There wasn't much to the inside of the house. Just an average 2-story house, 4 rooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. Georgia was already in the kitchen making dinner when Allie walked in. Allie took off her heels and walked barefoot on the nice cold hardwood floor. "Do you need help, Grandma?" she asked. "No, I don't think so, dear. She was just beginning to make a beef and potato stew. I can manage. You go rest. I'll wake you up when it's ready," she said with a smile. "Okay, Grandma. See you in a bit." She scurried to her room, threw off her dress, wrapped a thin blanket around her, let herself fall face first into her pillow, and drifted off almost instantaneously. A good amount of time passed, and Allie was woken up by the sound of knocking and Jack barking with excitement. She got up on her bed and tried to peer out the corner of the window, but couldn't see any cars or anyone. She could hear her grandmother try to quiet Jack as she led him to a separate room and closed the door. Quickly, Allie put her dress back on, leaving the belt on the dresser, while rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she ran downstairs to see what was going on. When she reached the bottom step, she saw her grandmother talking to a man in uniform. He was as tall as Danny and spoke very clearly with care. Another man, slightly shorter, stood to his right and was also in his military uniform. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Gunnery Sergeant Christopher Davis from Company K, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, from Camp Pendleton, California. This is Chaplain Robert Taylor." The chaplain acknowledged his introduction and gave a greeting. The gunnery sergeant continued, "Are you Mrs. Georgia Blaker?" "Good evening, sir." "Yes, I am her," Georgia replied. The gunnery sergeant then looked over to Allie and greeted her too. "Good evening, miss." Allie quickly responded, "Allison Blaker." "Good evening, sir." She felt an unease begin to rise up her neck. He smiled to her for a moment before his face became stern, yet sympathetic as he turned back to Georgia. "Mrs. Blaker, is it possible that we can step inside?" He removed his cover. "I need to talk to you about your son and grandson." She smiled, oblivious to the connotations of his purpose. Connotations which began to blossom and weigh on Allie's mind, though she tried to ignore them. "We're so pleased to have you stop by. Would you like some coffee or tea? How are my boys doing?" The two men looked at each other as their faces tightened. "Ma'am, if possible, could we sit for a moment?" "You too, Miss Blaker, if you wouldn't mind." Allie marched slowly towards her grandmother and the two soldiers. Her eyes were wide, and her throat began to dry out. Georgia took a seat in her rocker, still smiling, while Allie sat at the edge of the love seat, slightly facing away from the two men. Her eyes wandered off to a corner. "Mrs. Blaker." "Miss Blaker." The gunnery sergeant took a letter out, put it in the same hand as his cover, which he continued to hold solemnly to his chest as he knelt down to Georgia. Georgia's smile vanished. Before he began, he cleared his throat and spoke as gently and respectfully as he possibly could. "The Commandant of the Marine Corps has entrusted me to express his deep regret that your son, Joseph, and grandson, Daniel, were killed in." Allie felt the ground under her feet give way as her vision blurred and cracked. She did not make a sound as her chest began to tighten and time slowed. The top of her head seemed to split open as she began to taste the salt before vomit. She felt frozen there. Unable to move or think or interact, she felt the ice-cold grip of death begin to pull her downwards into oblivion. Just as she felt herself begin to pass the point of no return, a sound threw her back into her body. She looked over to her grandmother, who had almost fallen out of her chair in grief. Gunnery Sergeant Davis supported Georgia from falling forward onto the ground as she continued to let out a soul-shattering cry. Chaplain Taylor walked over to Allie and knelt beside her, close enough for her to know he was there, but far enough away to respect the moment of space she may need. Allie stared up at him, her ocean eyes terrified and filled with tears that began to fall and roll down her cheek. "Joseph, Danny." Georgia yelled their names before letting out a blood-curdling howl again. At the same moment she began to shriek. A loud crash of thunder cried and echoed with her pain. Large dark clouds had formed during the casualty notification, and lightning set the sky ablaze, while thunder pounded and fractured it. Heavy raindrops began to fall down upon the recently dehydrated and torrid small town, drowning out George's screams with a symphony of their own tragedy. "What the fuck?" Scott awoke with a powerful thud as his chair fell over. Fear splashed onto his face, causing the dream to end abruptly. Lying there, he slowly rubbed his eyes and temples in an attempt to fully wake up. He looked around from the floor and saw he was in the break room of the pub. The lights were off on the first floor, but he could see the orange glow echoing from the second. He let out a powerful yawn and muttered to himself, "What a fucked up dream. Something about a dog? Can't remember. Well, guess I should check on Charlie and Lou." He got up and put the chair back under the table. He took the steps at a slow, lethargic pace. The door to Lou's room was slightly ajar. Not to disturb or scare them, he gently and slowly tapped on the door with his knuckle and opened it with ease. He peered his head in. Lou was sitting on the couch watching over Charlie, who had been moved to her bed. "How's he doing?" Scott asked in a whisper. He'll be fine. Just needs some rest, Lou responded. She got up while lightly stretching her joints and looked at Scott. Tears began to fill her eyes, confusing him. Without a word, she walked out of the room, and he followed. Scott slowly shut the door behind him. She walked forward to the large window at the end of the hall, which was also the second-story fire escape. She turned around and stared at him, while resting on the window pane slightly. What's the matter? He tried to understand. Do you even care about my feelings? Huh? What do you mean? He began the systematic checklist of what he could have done or said wrong this time. You and Charlie are the only family I have left. Yet you come in here whenever you please, with whatever damage you have. You expect me to fix it like everything's normal. Tears began to roll down her cheeks. They sparkled in the moonlight. Suddenly, she glowed in his eyes. He felt an uncontrollable pull to her and approached, gently wrapping his arms around her. Listen, me and Charlie care about you. Don't worry about that stuff. We really appreciate you. Scott was speaking slowly and thinking critically, terrified of saying something wrong, making every word genuine and real. She did not show any signs that she accepted his words, but she also didn't show any signs that she wanted to pull away. She was still and silent, cocooned in his arms. Suddenly, she hugged him back with a powerful embrace as she buried her face into his chest. This was the first time that he held her since he left. She had missed it. She couldn't tell him how he had changed. She knew he had suffered trauma. She tried, but she couldn't stop it and began to cry softly. It's like I said, you and Charlie are all I have left. I don't know what to do if you two ever left. No one is here anymore. I would be completely alone. A blubbering mess. Scott felt a small chuckle begin to bubble in him as a smile crept onto his face and his heart ached uncontrollably. Don't you worry about that. It would take a whole lot of crazy amazing people to stop us. Plus, we would never die, 'cause if we did, you'd bring us back only to kill us. Lou seemed relieved from this and let him go. He lingered for a second on an exhale and brushed his cheek against her hair. Nostalgia washed over them both. Why can't this seem to happen without sadness? They both thought to themselves. Scott suddenly let her go, but kept a hand on the small of her back as they walked in silence. All right, he whispered. You deserve to get some sleep. Use the couch. I'll sleep on the floor. Scott sat down on the edge of the couch and patted the cushions firmly a couple of times, in an inviting manner. Lou wiped the remaining tears from her eyes. Yeah, okay. Thanks. She smiled at him and crawled onto the sofa as Scott slid down to the floor. Realizing the desk lamp was still on, Scott let out a quiet sigh as he stood back up. He walked over to the other side of the room and grabbed one of the 2 spare pillows and the only blanket off of the dresser. He returned to her and gently, without words, signaled for her to raise her head. He placed the pillow under her delicately, being careful not to pull her raven hair or cause her any discomfort. He then draped the blanket over her and, for good measure, or just to be silly, tucked her in a little. She smiled and made a small, contented sound. Scott then grabbed a pillow for himself, only pausing momentarily to stare at Charlie and then Lou, before finally turning off the lamp, fumbling his way back to the couch to lay down next to Lou. He could hear from her breathing that she had already fallen asleep, and he smiled again. Scott seemed unable to close his eyes as he stared into the darkness. He was aware that he was lost in a trance and was powerless to stop it. Deep emotions that he couldn't explain kept running through his nerves, giving him a sense of anxiety. Is this what it felt like to slowly lose your grip on reality?